He paid $500 for a haunted cabin. Then his dog found a family secret untouched for generations. The Avery family vanished without a trace. 30 years later, Jonah bought their cabin, ignoring the warnings. That night, the cabin burned to the ground. Jonah survived, thanks to Ridge. But as the firefighters put out the embers, Ridge refused to leave the ruins. He stood on top of the charred remains of the fireplace, howling at the ash. When they cleared the debris, they realized why. The fire had burned away the floor and revealed the metal trapdoor that the Avery family never escaped from. The snow came in hard, slanting across the windshield like 1,000 tiny knives. But Jonah Mercer kept driving. Storms never bothered him much. Years in Wyoming's search and rescue had taught him that weather was only weather until a human mistake turned it into a threat. Ridge, his grey-coated German shepherd, sat upright in the passenger seat, gaze fixed forward, ears flicking at every shift in the wind. The dog had the posture of a soldier on watch, not a pet along for the ride. Frost Canyon appeared through the white haze like an old photograph someone had forgotten to finish. A handful of stores, a diner with the lights off, a courthouse annex lit by a single buzzing bulb. Jonah parked beside a row of snow-buried trucks and shut off the engine. Ridge leapt down first, paws silent in the fresh powder. Inside the annex, the heat hit them like a wall layered with damp coats, stale coffee, and the faint smell of paper that should have been archived years ago. A crowd of maybe 20 people clustered in the folding chair rows. Farmers, loggers, a few retirees. They barely spoke, just shifted uneasily as if they knew something Jonah didn't. The auction was already halfway done. A rusted tractor, welding tools, a foreclosed hay barn. Jonah wasn't here for any of that. He didn't even know why he'd come, except that he'd woken that morning with an ache in his chest that felt like a memory he couldn't place. Ridge had stood at the door, waiting, certain. So Jonah had driven. The auctioneer flipped a page, voice flattening. Next lot. Parcel 7C, commonly referred to as the Avery cabin. The room changed all at once. Breath held, eyes lowered. Silence thick enough to taste. Structure abandoned 30 years. No utilities. 15 years of unpaid taxes. Opening bid, $500. No one moved. Not a twitch. Not even the sheriff in the back row, whose face was carved from a kind of polite stone. Jonah raised his hand. 500. The auctioneer looked relieved in a way that didn't make sense. Any advance? Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel cracked like a warning shot. A woman near the heater flinched. As Jonah walked to the clerk's table, he felt the hush follow him. Not judgment, something closer to pity or fear. The clerk slid the deed toward him as if the paper were hot enough to burn. "You sure you want that place?" she asked, voice low. "Just need a roof and some quiet." Jonah said. "Quiet," she repeated, but not like she believed the word. Outside, the storm softened. Snow fell slow and heavy, blanketing the world in a quiet Jonah didn't trust. He bought supplies at the hardware store, where the old man behind the counter took one look at the name on the receipt and shook his head. "You really bought the Avery place?" "Yeah. Should have asked around first, son. That land doesn't take kindly to company." Jonah pocketed the receipt. "Haunted?" "Haunted would be easier." The man said, "That cabin holds its secrets the way a wound holds glass, and it cuts anyone who gets too close." Jonah didn't respond. Ridge stood at his heel, ears tilted, eyes sharp. The old man looked at the dog and softened, but only a little. "Dogs feel things first," he said. "If he doesn't want to go near it, you turn back." Ridge gave a quiet exhale. Not fear. Something else. They reached the property at dusk. The road narrowed to twin ruts through old pines bowed under snow. The cabin came into view suddenly, as if it hadn't been there a moment earlier. Weather-beaten logs, a sagging porch, frost-bitten windows, a place abandoned but not empty. Jonah stepped out. Ridge stayed frozen in the truck bed, muscles coiled. He stared at the cabin with the tense focus Jonah had only seen twice before, once on a ridge during a nighttime rescue, and once on the day Jonah's father went missing. "Come on, boy." Ridge didn't move. Then the dog inhaled once, sharp and deep, and jumped down. Not willingly, but decisively, as if bracing for whatever waited inside. The cabin door groaned open. The air inside was colder than the storm. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades ago. A mug on the table, a jacket by the door. Dust so thick the whole place felt muffled, like it had been holding its breath since the day the Avery family vanished. Ridge walked in front of Jonah, slow, head low, scanning. Then he stopped dead. At the fireplace. A towering stone hearth built from river rock. Dark, silent. But Ridge stood there rigid, hackles raised, tail stiff and straight. No growl, no bark, just a stillness so intense it felt like a message. Jonah crouched. "You smell something?" Ridge lifted a paw and tapped a single stone. Not random, not curious. A deliberate signal Jonah recognized from years ago, from training sessions, from one moment in the mountains when Ridge had found a missing hiker buried under snow. The dog was marking danger, or discovery, or both. Jonah ran his hand along the stones. One felt colder than the others, smooth where the others were rough. Too smooth. A sudden thump hit the roof. Jonah stood, hand to flashlight. Ridge didn't flinch. He stared straight at the hearth. Another thump, then a scrape outside, like boots moving against snow. Jonah reached for the door, but Ridge growled sharply, cutting him off. Jonah froze. Ridge wasn't warning him about the outside. He was warning him about the inside. Jonah stepped back. A breath. Another. The storm outside picked up, the wind howling through the pines. Then Ridge pushed against Jonah's leg and positioned himself between Jonah and the hearth, staring at the stones with such fierce stillness that Jonah felt something cold crawl up his spine. "This place isn't haunted," Jonah whispered to no one, but Ridge's eyes said it clearly. Something in this cabin had been waiting for him, and it wasn't finished yet. The wind clawed at the cabin through the night, shaking the old logs until they groaned like something buried beneath them wanted out. Jonah lay awake on the cot he'd dragged into the corner, the thin blanket useless against the cold creeping up from the floorboards. The storm outside sounded wrong, not just fierce but deliberate, like breath held and released through teeth. Ridge had not rested once. The dog stood rooted in front of the stone hearth, head low, shoulders stiff, eyes unblinking. Every few minutes he let out a quiet rumble, deep enough to vibrate the air but controlled, as if he were warning something without waking it. Jonah had only heard Ridge use that sound 3 times in his life. Once on a rescue in the Tetons, when Ridge had sensed the ground was about to give beneath them. Once when a lost child had been hiding under collapsed flooring. And once the night Jonah's father never came home. Jonah sat up, rubbing the chill from his arms. "You're making me nervous." Ridge didn't look back. He lifted his nose to the hearth and inhaled sharply, then stepped half an inch closer. Another growl rose from his chest, quieter than the wind but far more dangerous. Jonah stood, grabbed the lantern, and walked toward the mantel. Dust thickened the air. An old jacket still hung on a wooden peg by the door, the kind miners wore decades ago. A few books lay on a shelf, their titles faded. On the table near the window, a calendar from 1993 sat open to October. He hadn't noticed that earlier. He flipped it over. Nothing was written on it. Not an appointment, not a mark, just a month frozen in time. He picked up one of the books. Inside the cover was a faint signature, Elias Avery. The name clicked like a lock turning. He'd heard it before, back when he was a teenager, sitting at the kitchen table while his father talked to a man from the county. Something about an Avery. Something about an investigation gone wrong. Something his father refused to repeat once Jonah was old enough to ask questions. Jonah looked up at Ridge. The dog had not moved. He pressed his paw against the same stone Jonah had touched last night. Tapped once, hard enough to echo. Jonah crouched beside him. Ridge didn't acknowledge him, didn't break his stare. Jonah felt the dog's muscles twitch beneath the fur, locked tight like he was holding himself back from lunging. "All right," he whispered. "What do you feel?" He placed a hand on the stone Ridge had singled out. It was colder than the others, even near the fire Jonah had tried and failed to light. Smooth, unnaturally so. Jonah leaned closer, eyes tracing the seams. A thin crack ran across one edge, almost disguised by dust. Not natural, not age, intentional. He pressed his ear to it. Nothing. No hollow, no airflow. Just silence. But Ridge leaned hard, nose touching the stone, body trembling with a tension Jonah recognized too well. This wasn't fear. This was instinct sharpened to the point of pain. Jonah stepped back and grabbed his pack. Old mining towns had secrets buried everywhere. If Elias Avery had disappeared without a trace, he might have hidden more than rumors left behind. He pulled out a small brush and swept the dust from the stone, revealing faint marks. Not carvings. Pressure lines. Someone had pried this open before, maybe more than once. He checked the bookshelves, the desk, the window frames. Everything else had settled into abandonment, but the hearth looked untouched. Untouched in a way that meant someone had preserved it. Jonah picked up the old calendar again and flipped through the pages. Tucked behind the last month was a yellowed newspaper clipping. He unfolded it carefully. Local miner Elias Avery declared missing. Cabin found undisturbed. Jonah frowned. Missing. The paper used the word gently, almost reluctantly. The sheriff quoted in the article mentioned nothing suspicious, only a man who likely chose to disappear. Jonah had grown up around men like that. They didn't vanish for no reason. Ridge suddenly barked, one sharp burst that cracked the air like a gunshot. Jonah spun around. Ridge wasn't facing the door, he was facing the wall beside the hearth. Light from the lantern caught something Jonah hadn't seen before. A thin sliver of silver wedged between logs. Jonah reached for it. A metal tab. He tugged gently, expecting it to break. Instead, the tab shifted the whole panel. A hidden compartment Jonah had walked past all night swung open half an inch. Ridge stepped forward and touched his nose to the crack, then looked at Jonah. Not frantic, not afraid. Urgent. Jonah pulled the panel fully open. Inside was a narrow cavity lined with old cedar planks. A box rested in the bottom. Small, wooden, hand-carved. He lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than it should have been. Ridge sat, eyes locked on the box. "You knew it was here," Jonah whispered. "Didn't you?" He placed the box on the table. The latch was rusted but intact. When he flipped it open, the hinges groaned. Inside were 3 objects. A pocket knife with the initials EA engraved, a faded photograph of 2 men standing in front of this very cabin, and a folded sheet of paper Jonah recognized instantly by the handwriting. His father's. Jonah stared at the signature at the bottom. Thomas Mercer. The storm outside screamed against the walls. Ridge whined softly and nudged Jonah's elbow. Jonah unfolded the paper. The ink had bled at the edges, but the words were clear. If someone finds this, Elias didn't leave on his own. And neither will they let me. The truth is beneath the stones. Protect it. Trust the dog. He knows before any of us do. Jonah's throat went dry. His father had been here. His father had known Elias Avery. and his father had hidden something under this very hearth 30 years ago. Ridge pressed his head against Jonah's arm. Jonah folded the letter slowly. "We just stepped into something, boy." Ridge's ears tipped forward, something that never wanted to stay buried. Ridge's bark cut through the cabin like a clean blade. Not loud, not panicked. A single sharp note that Jonah recognized instantly. It was the sound Ridge used when he found something. A body under snow, an air pocket under rubble, a truth under the noise. Jonah dropped the letter and moved to his side. Ridge kept his nose pressed to one particular stone near the base of the hearth, his body tight, tail low, ears flicked forward in complete focus. He didn't look at Jonah. He didn't need to. Jonah knelt and ran his hand across the stone. Unlike the others, it wasn't rounded and weather-worn. It was rectangular, edges sharper, surface smoother. Too perfect for a hearth built in the 1960s. He tapped it with his knuckles. Dull. He pressed harder. The faintest movement answered him, almost imagined. "All right," Jonah whispered. "Let's see what you're guarding." He crossed the room, retrieved his flashlight and a pry bar from his pack, and returned to the hearth. Ridge stayed planted, as if bracing for what would come next. Jonah wedged the pry bar under the edge of the suspicious stone and pushed slowly, careful not to fracture anything that might collapse the structure. The stone resisted at first, then shifted with a soft, grinding sound. Dust stirred into the air, carrying the cold scent of something long sealed away. Jonah froze. Beneath the stone was a pocket of black, a cavity that shouldn't exist. Ridge stepped back, finally breaking his stare, and moved to Jonah's side. He nosed the edge of the opening, then sat with the gravity of a dog who had fulfilled a task, older than instinct. Jonah slid the stone out inch by inch, trying not to think about the fact that someone in his own family had touched this same surface decades earlier. When the stone finally thudded onto the floor, a small chamber revealed itself. Rough cut, perfectly square, lined with old timber, dry as bone. Inside were 3 items: a military-grade steel box, a stack of notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, a sealed envelope with handwriting Jonah knew better than his own. He reached for the notebooks first. The oilcloth peeled back stiffly. Inside, 4 journals, thick with years of writing. The first page bore the name, Elias Avery. Jonah sat down on the cold floor, the flashlight balanced between his knees. He opened the first journal. Neat block handwriting. Dated January 1991. Test results from Northline site show deviations again. Told the foreman, he said, "Keep quiet." Jonah flipped ahead. They poisoned the water. They buried the report. No one believes me, except Tom Mercer. Jonah's breath hitched. Tom Mercer, his father. He turned another page. The ink had smeared near the bottom from what looked like a thumbprint. Tom says we need proof. Not theories. Proof. He thinks the cabin is being watched. Something in the woods last night. I heard it. Tom said not to mention it to the sheriff. Said not to trust him. Jonah closed the journal. For a moment, the cabin felt smaller, the air thinner. Ridge pressed his shoulder gently against Jonah's side, steadying him. He lifted the sealed envelope next. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, his father's looping script. Jonah swallowed hard and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, yellowed at the edges, words written in haste. If you find this, Jonah, it means I didn't finish what I started. Elias was right. They were poisoning the valley for years. Northline paid to bury the truth, and the county helped them. If Elias disappeared, it wasn't by choice. The lines blurred for a second. Jonah blinked them clear. The last paragraph hit like a punch. This cabin is part of our family's past. Your grandfather knew Elias. I didn't tell you because I wanted you free from all of this. But Ridge is trained differently. He will sense what you cannot. Trust him, And if you're reading this, keep going. Do what I couldn't." Jonah leaned back against the cold stones. His father had been here, had touched these same journals, had hidden them, had known he might never make it home. Ridge nudged Jonah's knee, eyes bright with a strange mixture of urgency and calm, as if to say that the shock could wait, but the danger could not. Jonah breathed slowly, trying to steady the flood of questions. Why had his father never told him? Why had the Avery family vanished? And why had Ridge led him straight to this place, as if he'd been born with the memory of it? He opened the steel box next. Its latches snapped with a metallic sting. Inside were soil samples sealed in plastic, a map marked with red X's across Frost Canyon, and a cassette recorder wrapped in cloth. Jonah held the recorder in his hand. Cold, heavy. Ridge stared at it with an intensity Jonah had only ever seen once when they found a missing ranger half-conscious under a snowbank. The dog knew the weight of this, somehow. Knew the truth wasn't just buried under stone, but buried inside Jonah himself. Jonah clicked the recorder. Nothing. No static. No tape. It was empty. He checked the steel box again. There, in the bottom, under the samples, was a cassette. Handwritten label. Avery, Mercer. Last night. Jonah's heart pounded. He reached for it, but Ridge suddenly stepped forward, body blocking Jonah's hand from the box. Jonah froze. "Hey, what is it?" Ridge's head snapped toward the window. A low, deep growl rolled out of him. Jonah grabbed the flashlight and crossed the floor silently, every muscle locked. He pulled the curtain back an inch. Tree line. Snow falling. Nothing. But Ridge didn't growl at nothing. Jonah set the cassette carefully aside, extinguished the lantern, and crouched. Another growl from Ridge. Deeper now. Someone was outside. 30 years of secrets had not stayed buried. And whoever had watched Elias Avery disappear might be watching the cabin again. The storm thinned by morning, leaving Frost Canyon wrapped in a cold that crept through the cracks of the cabin like memory. Jonah sat at the table with the journals spread before him, Ridge resting at his feet, head angled towards the hearth, as if he refused to forget what lay beneath it. Jonah opened the second notebook. Elias Avery's handwriting grew more frantic with each page. Northline minerals drilled deeper than they claimed. Waste seeped into the groundwater. Livestock dying. Kids getting sick. They test the wells and throw out the results. Tom says we need undeniable proof. Jonah felt a tug in his chest. His father had been the kind of man who always carried weight quietly, as if the truth itself was something fragile that needed shielding. Now Jonah understood why. He picked up one of the bagged samples from the steel box. Ridge leaned forward, nose twitching. A low whine escaped him, almost pained. Jonah frowned. "You smell that?" Ridge didn't answer with sound. He pressed his paw softly on the sample bag, nose wrinkling. Jonah opened the journal again. Over and over the same word appeared. Benzene. Solvents. Heavy metals. Ridge nosed another sample bag and jerked back with a sharp shake of his head. Jonah blinked. Ridge had smelled things on rescues, blood, fear, human trace, but this reaction was different. This was recognition, disgust, instinctive warning. The dog knew the scent of the chemical. Somehow. But how? Jonah didn't have time to finish the thought. Boots crunched outside. Slow. Deliberate. Jonah stiffened. Ridge shot upright, turning toward the door, his body rising into a rigid stance meant to block, not attack. Jonah placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. Ridge didn't budge. A knock echoed through the cabin. Jonah closed the notebooks and slid them under the table with a single sweep of his arm. Ridge stepped in front of him, shoulders squared. Another knock, louder this time. Jonah opened the door 2 inches. Sheriff Reed Harmon stood on the porch, snow clinging to his coat, a smile stretched across his face with the wrong kind of friendliness. Morning, Jonah. Heard you bought yourself the Avery place. Jonah forced the door wider. Ridge didn't move, didn't greet, didn't sniff. He simply watched. Sheriff Harmon stepped inside without waiting. He looked around with an expression meant to seem curious, but landed somewhere closer to calculating. His gaze drifted over the dusty shelves, the table, the floorboards. But when his eyes slid toward the hearth, Jonah felt Ridge push, gently against his leg, subtle but clear. The sheriff's attention lingered on that spot too long. Place hasn't changed much, Harmon said. Shame you bought it. Folks say it's unlucky. Jonah kept his voice even. Seems fine to me. Harmon stepped further in, hands buried in his coat pockets. That's because you haven't been here long. Avery was a troubled man. Lots of folks assumed he ran. Couldn't handle the pressure. Jonah studied him. The sheriff's tone didn't match the words. His eyes stayed hard even while his mouth curved politely. Pressure from what? Harmon shrugged. Who knows? Miners get strange ideas sometimes. Jonah noticed the sheriff's boots. Not a trace of mud. No dust. No scuffs from the trail. He hadn't walked here. He'd driven up early before the snow settled. Purposeful. Ridge shifted again, placing himself fully between Jonah and Harmon. The dog's ears were rigid. His gaze locked on the sheriff's belt, where a small utility knife rested sheathed. Good dog, Harmon murmured. Ridge didn't blink. Harmon stepped closer to the hearth, pretending to admire the stonework. This place has history, he said. Avery built that fireplace himself. People say he spent more time on these stones than on the whole cabin. Jonah's chest tightened. The sheriff wasn't admiring anything. He was checking for disturbance, checking if someone had found what Avery left. Jonah forced a calm breath. You knew Avery well? Harmon kept his eyes on the stone, tapping it lightly with his knuckle. The sound was dull. Jonah prayed the sheriff didn't hear the difference. Everyone knew him. Harmon said, Quiet man. Stubborn. Not the type to disappear unless something pushed him. Like what? Harmon smiled. That's what I'd like to know too. He stepped away from the hearth and leaned against the door frame. Jonah could feel Ridge's breath quicken. The dog was no longer guarding a secret. He was guarding Jonah. You find anything interesting around here? Harmon asked. Jonah met his gaze. Just dust, and bad insulation. Harmon chuckled without warmth. Well, if you see anything out of place, you come straight to me. Avery's case is still open. The county doesn't need rumors starting again. Jonah nodded, but his stomach tightened. Rumors. The sheriff feared rumors more than facts, which meant he feared discovery. Harmon adjusted his coat. Cold's getting worse. Roads'll be shut by nightfall. You might find yourself stuck here for a while. Is that a warning? Harmon's smile thinned. Just neighborly advice. He stepped outside and paused with his back to Jonah. Dogs feel things before people do, he said. Watch your animal. He'll tell you when trouble's coming. Ridge growled, deep, low. The kind Jonah had felt more than heard years ago, right before an avalanche broke loose. Harmon didn't look back. He walked to his truck and disappeared down the tree line. When the engine faded, Jonah shut the door and knelt beside Ridge. The dog pressed his forehead against Jonah's chest, trembling with the effort to stay still. Jonah stroked his neck. You're telling me he knows, aren't you? Ridge stepped back to the hearth and sat, posture rigid, eyes locked on the same stone Jonah had pried loose. Jonah looked at the hearth again. The sheriff hadn't missed it. He had recognized it. Jonah whispered, We're not just holding evidence. We're holding the reason people vanished. Ridge didn't move. He just stared at the stonework with the same unwavering focus he had used to find trapped bodies under collapsed earth. as if he already understood the truth Jonah hadn't yet said aloud. Someone had silenced Elias Avery, and someone had tried to silence Jonah's father. And now someone was watching the cabin again. The snow had stopped by late afternoon, leaving the world too quiet. The kind of quiet Jonah didn't trust. He walked the perimeter of the cabin with Ridge at his side, scanning the tree line for anything out of place. It didn't take long. Boot prints, not his, not the sheriff's, fresh, crisp in the powder and circling the cabin at a slow, careful pace. Whoever made them had moved with intention, not curiosity. They never approached the front door. They kept to the shadows. Ridge lowered his head, nose brushing the tracks. His body tightened and a low vibration rolled out of his chest. Jonah crouched, studying the pattern. Heavy tread. Multiple passes. Someone had watched the cabin for a long time. Jonah stood. Whoever it was had come close enough to see the hearth, close enough to see the stone Jonah had removed, close enough to know there was something worth stealing. Ridge's head snapped toward the trees. A faint shift, branches settling, snow falling where nothing should have disturbed it. Whoever had been watching hadn't left. Jonah backed toward the cabin. Ridge stayed locked on the trees, moving one step at a time, never turning his back. When they reached the porch, Jonah opened the door, motioning Ridge in. But Ridge didn't move. Jonah whispered, "Ridge, inside." The dog finally retreated, but only enough to step across the threshold. His body faced the forest as Jonah shut the door and threw the bolt. The rest of the day passed in uneasy stillness. Jonah tried to focus on the journals, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, where the pines stood crowded and dark, as if hiding a pulse. Ridge barely left his post by the hearth. The sun fell early. Darkness settled like a blanket over the clearing. Jonah set the lantern low, checked the rifle he'd carried since Wyoming, and sat where he could see the door and Ridge in a single glance. Ridge lifted his head suddenly. Not a growl, not a bark, a breath. Jonah felt the hairs on his arms rise. Then the sound came. Barely audible. A scrape near the window. Slow, intentional, metal brushing wood. Jonah killed the lantern. Shadows swallowed the cabin. Ridge moved first. He shot to the door, body rigid, tail stiff. He didn't bark. Ridgeline dogs barked for warning. But this was threat, direct threat. Ridge stood like a shield between Jonah and the door, head tilted just enough to sense movement on the other side. The latch rattled. Jonah lifted the rifle. The latch rattled again, harder. Then the door gave. A dark shape burst through the opening, all momentum and violence. Jonah swung the rifle up, but Ridge reached the intruder first. The dog hit him like a battering ram, teeth snapping a breath from the man's arm, forcing him off balance. The intruder cursed, stumbled back against the wall, and scrambled for the hearth. He was going for the opening. Jonah fired. The shot cracked the air. Wood splintered above the intruder's shoulder, showering him with dust. The man flinched, and Ridge lunged again, jaws locking onto the man's sleeve. The intruder yanked free, leaving torn fabric in Ridge's teeth. He bolted for the door. Jonah lunged forward, but Ridge beat him to it. The dog slammed into the man's legs, sending him skidding across the porch. The intruder regained his footing and sprinted into the trees, disappearing into the black. Jonah stood in the doorway, breath loud, rifle raised, but the man was gone. Ridge stopped at the edge of the clearing, growling into the dark. The sound echoed back, bouncing between the pines until it vanished completely. Jonah returned inside. Ridge followed, still alert, chest rising and falling hard. Jonah shut the door, bracing it with a chair, then walked to the hearth. The false stone lay where he'd left it. The hallowed opening beneath was undisturbed. The notebooks were safe. The steel box was safe. The letter from his father remained tucked under the journals. But on the floor beside the hearth was something new, a black glove, leather. damp with melting snow. Jonah picked it up. Inside the glove was a tag printed with a company logo. Northline Minerals. Ridge growled again, deeper than before. Jonah closed his hand around the glove. "They know," he said quietly. "They know exactly what's under this cabin." Ridge stood beside him, breath steadying, gaze sharp. Jonah looked down at him. "You kept them away." Ridge leaned his shoulder against Jonah's leg, the weight deliberate, grounding. Jonah exhaled. The truth was no longer a secret waiting in the dark. It had teeth now, and so did the danger that wanted it buried. Whatever Northline had done 30 years ago, whoever they had silenced, they were still watching, still listening, still willing to break down doors in the night. Jonah locked eyes with Ridge. "We're not alone out here anymore." Ridge didn't blink. He stood watch until dawn. The sky turned the color of steel that evening, the kind of bruised dusk that warned of violence long before it arrived. Jonah spent the hours after the break-in packing the most important evidence into a waterproof satchel. Ridge paced the floorboards non-stop, nose twitching, ears snapping to every sound. Outside, when Ridge finally stopped pacing, Jonah felt it before he saw it. Stillness. A tight, suffocating quiet that didn't belong in the wilderness. Ridge lifted his head and growled. Not the warning growl. The other one. The one Jonah had heard only twice in his life. A sound that meant the threat was already here. Headlights washed faintly across the snow outside. Jonah killed the lantern instantly. Ridge moved to the door, body stiff, tail still. Jonah crouched beside him and looked through the sliver of the window. Sheriff Reed Harmon stepped out first. No coat this time, no friendly smile, just that hollow stare and a gas can swinging loosely from his hand. Two men followed, heavy coats, rifles, masks. Jonah's breath tightened. Ridge pressed his shoulder to Jonah's knee, steady and cold. Harmon walked right up to the porch, glanced around like a man checking his crops, then nodded to his men. "Time to end this," he said. His voice didn't carry emotion, just purpose. Jonah grabbed Ridge's collar. "Quiet, boy." But Ridge didn't make a sound. He leaned into Jonah's leg, waiting for the next move. Then Harmon splashed gasoline across the porch and window frames. Jonah's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Ridge inhaled sharply, muscles locking as the fumes seeped under the door. One of Harmon's men struck a flare. The hiss was louder than the wind. Jonah moved fast. He grabbed the satchel, slung it over his shoulder, checked the rifle, and whispered to Ridge. "Back door. Now." But Ridge didn't move toward the back door. He stared at the front. The flare flew through the broken pane. Flames erupted up the curtains and leapt across the walls in seconds. Heat roared through the cabin. The men outside cheered. Jonah aimed through the smoke and fired a warning shot. It wasn't enough. Gunfire ripped through the front wall, spraying splinters across the room. Jonah ducked behind the table, Ridge right beside him. The dog didn't flinch. Didn't cower. He only looked to Jonah for the signal. Jonah pointed to the back. Ridge bolted ahead, Jonah close on his heels. But as they reached the rear window, a shot cracked against the frame, ricocheting into Ridge's shoulder. The dog stumbled. Jonah caught him before he fell. "No, Ridge. Stay with me. Come on, buddy." Ridge's breath hitched, but he pushed himself upright, refusing to drop. The wound wasn't deep, but blood soaked into his fur. Jonah's throat tightened with panic. Rage followed right behind. He smashed the back window with the butt of his rifle and shoved Ridge through first. Flames crawled up the walls behind them, licking at the ceiling beams. Harmon's voice echoed outside. "If the fire doesn't get him, we will." Jonah slipped out into the snow beside Ridge, crouching low. Harmon's men were circling. Jonah could hear them crunching through the drifts like wolves tightening a perimeter. Ridge nudged Jonah once, then he darted into the trees, low and fast despite the injury. Jonah followed. Gunfire chased them. Trees exploded with splinters. Snow jumped in violent bursts around their feet. Ridge wove through the brush, leading Jonah toward the ravine behind the cabin. They slid down the slope, snow swallowing their boots. Ridge yelped once as his shoulder scraped a fallen log, but he kept moving, fast and determined. Jonah scrambled after him, lungs burning. Behind them, the cabin groaned. The roof collapsed in a shower of sparks that lit the sky. Harmon's furious shout broke through the roar of flames. "Find them! Now!" Jonah and Ridge disappeared deeper into the trees. Only when they reached an old hunting trail, half buried under winter, did Ridge stop. He pressed himself against Jonah, trembling but upright. Jonah knelt and checked his shoulder. The bullet had grazed him. Painful, but survivable. "You saved us," Jonah whispered. Again. Ridge leaned his head into Jonah's chest. No whine, no fear. Just that steady presence Jonah had come to trust more than his own instincts. Smoke from the burning cabin drifted through the trees. Jonah looked at it, jaw tight. Everything the Avery family had hidden, everything his father had buried, all of it nearly lost. But not lost. The journals, the samples, the recordings, they were all strapped against Jonah's back. He pulled out his phone, shielding its faint light under his jacket. The screen cracked, battery low, but still working. He typed fast. "Miriam. It's Jonah Mercer. I have what my father died for. Northline is still active. Send location. This cannot wait." Miriam Fletcher, investigative reporter. The one who had believed his father when no one else would. Jonah hit send. A moment later, Ridge lifted his head, ears twitching toward distant footsteps. Jonah pocketed the phone. "Time to move, boy." Ridge stepped forward, wounded but resolute, guiding Jonah toward the darkness of the forest, away from the fire, away from Harmon, toward the truth that had survived 30 years underground. The cabin behind them burned until it was nothing but a skeleton of charred beams. But they weren't running. They were carrying the last breath of a man who had tried to warn the world. And this time, Jonah would not fail him. The storm had calmed by morning, but the world hadn't. Frost Canyon woke to sirens, helicopters, and the kind of federal presence that made even the bravest locals step back onto their porches and close the door slowly. Jonah and Ridge watched it all from a ridge above the highway. Ridge sat close enough that Jonah could feel the dog's breath against his sleeve. Jonah kept one hand on Ridge's neck, grounding himself. Ridge didn't tremble. He never did. But the tension in his body said he was reading every movement below. Miriam's car crawled through the snow-choked road and parked beside an FBI mobile command van. She stepped out quickly, hunched against the wind, hair whipping around her face. She looked up toward the tree line, toward where Jonah had told her to meet him. Ridge let out a quiet rumble that wasn't warning. Recognition. "Yeah, that's her," Jonah murmured. He descended the slope, Ridge trotting at his side, wounded shoulder stiff but not slowing his pace. When they stepped out of the trees, Miriam's face changed. Not with fear, with relief. "You're alive," she said. "Barely," Jonah answered. Ridge walked to her, sniffed once, then pressed his head against her hip. That was Ridge's seal of approval. Miriam knelt to touch his fur. "You did good, boy." Ridge closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. Jonah handed her the satchel. "Everything's in there. Journals, samples, maps of contamination sites, and—" He hesitated. "Entries from my father." Miriam's breath caught. "Jonah, your father tried to warn us years ago. I should have listened harder back then." Jonah didn't answer. Some wounds had lived long enough that words couldn't reach them anymore. A federal agent jogged over. "Ms. Fletcher, we've got something. You'll want to see this." Miriam looked to Jonah. "Come with me." He nodded, and the three of them walked toward the command van. Inside, screens flickered with satellite maps and synchronized radio chatter. An agent slid a file across the table toward Miriam. "We got a call this morning from a man named Troy Gallant," the agent said. "Former Level 3 technician at Northline Minerals. Says he was forced out 28 years ago for raising concerns about illegal dumping." Jonah straightened. "Forced out how?" The agent tapped the file. "Accidental equipment malfunction in a test tunnel. Nearly killed him. Afterward, Northline paid him off and sealed his personnel records. He's been living under a different name since." "Where is he now?" Jonah asked. "Right outside," the agent said. They stepped out of the van as a thin, worn-looking man approached, escorted by 2 agents. He walked with a slight limp, eyes sunken but sharp. The kind of man who had carried truth alone for too long. Troy stopped in front of Jonah and looked him over. "You're the Mercer kid, ain't you?" Jonah nodded. "You knew my father?" Troy swallowed hard. "Worked beside him down in Tunnel 12. Your old man wasn't crazy. He was brave. He and Elias Avery were close to blowing the lid off everything. Then one night, the air monitor failed." Or so they said. Jonah inhaled, the cold burning deep. "They killed them?" Troy shook his head. "No, they didn't need to. They just made sure the cave-in looked natural. The company sealed the tunnel the next morning and called it an accident. Your father barely made it out. Avery was gone before anyone reached him." Ridge growled softly, a low pulse of anger, as if he understood every word. Troy looked down at the dog. "He reminds me of Avery's old shepherd, the one that wouldn't leave the mine entrance until they dragged him off." Ridge stepped closer, sniffing the man's hand, then sat in front of him. That was Ridge's way of saying, "Keep talking." Troy glanced at the agents. "I've still got records, data they told me to destroy, but I didn't. I hid it, because one day I knew someone would come looking." Miriam's voice softened. "Troy, if you testify, this opens everything." Troy nodded slowly, jaw tight. "I'm ready. I should have done it years ago." One agent hurried forward, radio pressed to his ear. "Mom, it's starting. You need to see this." They moved to the edge of the lot. State troopers were filing into the valley. Tactical teams were clearing the roads. And on the ridge near the burned cabin, agents surrounded Sheriff Reed Harmon, hands behind his head, mouth tight with fury. Jonah watched him get shoved into the back of a federal truck. For a moment, Harmon's eyes locked onto Jonah's across the distance. No anger, no shame. Just a hollow acceptance of a war he'd already lost. "You were right, Jonah," Miriam said quietly beside him. "Your father and Avery didn't disappear. They were erased." Ridge sat, eyes pinned on Harmon until the truck's doors slammed shut. Jonah felt something heavy shift inside him. Not satisfaction, not victory, something cleaner. The slow drop of a weight he had carried for half his life. But it wasn't over. An agent approached. "Mr. Mercer, federal teams are heading into the abandoned Northline tunnels now. With Mr. Gallant's testimony and your evidence, this could turn into the biggest environmental case in state history." Jonah nodded, but his eyes drifted to Ridge. The shepherd sat firm, breathing steady, blood still dried against his fur from the night before. A soldier who never asked for medals. Jonah crouched beside him. "We did it, boy." Ridge pressed his head to Jonah's chest, closing his eyes with a long exhale. Miriam watched the two of them, her expression softening. "You know, Jonah, if it weren't for him, none of this gets out." Jonah stroked Ridge's neck gently. "I know. He's been telling me the truth since the first night we stepped into that cabin." Ridge lifted his head, ears pricked toward the forest where the Avery cabin once stood, as if guarding the last breath of the past, as if waiting for whatever came next. Winter gave way slowly in Frost Canyon, as if the land itself needed time to breathe again. The scars of the fire had faded under blankets of new pine needles and fresh undergrowth. The hillside where the Avery cabin once stood now sprouted young spruce, their bright tips reaching for light with stubborn hope. 1 year had passed. Jonah hammered the last board into place and stepped back, wiping sawdust from his jacket. The new cabin wasn't big. It wasn't elaborate. But it stood on solid beams, warm wood, and clean windows that framed the forest like a painting. A proper roof, a stone porch, a fireplace built by his own hands. The old hearth was gone for good, but the land no longer felt haunted. Ridge trotted out from behind the cabin, a soft leather vest buckled around his chest. His gait was confident. Again, his shoulder healed, though the faint scar in his fur was still visible under sunlight. He paused beside Jonah, chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. "Morning shift done?" Jonah asked. Ridge sat down with the calm pride of a Cho who knew exactly what he'd accomplished. The program had started small, a few former search and rescue workers, a couple families who had lost homes during the contamination years, people who carried the weight of grief in their shoulders, in their breathing, in the silence they tried so hard to pretend wasn't crushing them. Ridge had taken to them all. He sat with veterans during panic attacks, lay his head on trembling knees, walked side by side with a boy who couldn't step into the woods without shaking. Ridge never barked at their fear. He absorbed it, eased it, steadied it, as if the fire, the chase, the danger had carved into him a deeper kind of knowing. Miriam said it best the day she visited. "He doesn't heal scars, Jonah. He teaches people that scars can live without hurting." Ridge nudged Jonah's hand now, as if reminding him that he too still carried some of those scars. Jonah scratched behind his ears. "Let's check the fence line." They walked the trail behind the cabin. Snowmelt dripped from high branches. The forest didn't feel like something waiting to strike anymore. It felt alive, patient, awake. In the distance, the town of Frost Canyon moved slowly but steadily. New families had returned. The elementary school had reopened with a fresh playground and clean water lines. The old general store had been repainted, a bright shade of blue that seemed almost defiant. Northline's executives were awaiting trial. Their old mines were sealed and monitored. Land recovery grants had flowed into the valley. Every week, a new truck arrived carrying seedlings, soil testers, water specialists. Frost Canyon, the town that had been written off as a ghost, was breathing again. Jonah paused near a stump where he had once sat counting the minutes between federal sirens. Ridge hopped onto it, balanced, and looked out over the valley. "See that, boy?" Jonah said. "Your work did that." Ridge didn't puff his chest or bark in pride. He simply looked, ears forward, as if acknowledging the truth of it. They continued down the slope until they reached a small footbridge Jonah had built over the creek. The water beneath ran clear now, a soft, musical rush over granite. Ridge drank from it without hesitation. That alone was proof the land was healing. Jonah crouched, scooping the cold water into his hands. The chill hit his bones. It felt grounding, almost spiritual. "I used to think my father ran from something," he said quietly. Ridge lifted his head. "I get it now. He wasn't running. He was holding on. He stayed because he believed this place was worth saving. He didn't live long enough to finish the fight." Ridge stepped closer, leaning against Jonah's knee, a quiet, unwavering presence. Jonah ran a hand over Ridge's back. "But we did." They headed home before dusk, the light settling gold on the treetops. Jonah lit the new fireplace. Flames climbed the stone face, warm and controlled. Ridge settled onto his bed beside the hearth, watching Jonah with slow, steady blinks that always signaled contentment. From the porch, Jonah could see the stars pricking through the darkening sky. For the first time in decades, the air didn't carry the metallic hint of chemical runoff. Just pine, smoke, earth. He stepped outside, sat on the porch step, and Ridge followed, resting his head against Jonah's thigh. "We built something," Jonah murmured. "You and me. Something good." Ridge's tail swept the wood once, slow and soft. Wind rustled through new branches. A distant owl called from the ravine. The night felt whole again. Jonah exhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the breath didn't hurt. He looked down at Ridge. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." Ridge nudged Jonah's hand and settled still beside him, guarding the quiet, guarding the land, guarding the truth that had survived 3 decades underground. The cabin behind them glowed warm against the dark, a home built on ashes, a valley built on recovery, and a bond built on loyalty deeper than words. The bus door folded open with a hiss, letting out a wave of chatter and cold mountain air. Frost Canyon Middle School's 8th graders spilled onto the gravel path in bright coats, some slipping on patches of ice, others already pointing towards the tree line as if expecting a bear to step out and wave. Jonah waited near the porch rail of the new cabin, hands in his jacket pockets. Ridge sat beside him, upright and composed, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. Whenever kids came, Ridge assumed the posture of a statesman, watching, judging, letting them earn his trust. The program director, Ms. Alden, blew her whistle once. Kids quieted just enough to count as civilized. "All right," she said. "This is Mr. Jonah Mercer. And that, of course, is Ridge." A dozen eyes dropped to the dog instantly. Ridge didn't move, but his ears twitched, acknowledging the attention like a celebrity deciding whether to greet a crowd. Jonah offered a small wave. "Ridge does most of the touring. I'm just here to translate." The kids laughed, easing into the space. Jonah stepped down from the porch with Ridge flanking him. He always walked a little differently around children. Slower, rounder movements, giving them time to decide whether they wanted to come close. A boy with glasses pointed at the cabin. "My dad said this used to be a haunted place. Like, really haunted." "Is it true?" Jonah smiled. "Depends what you think haunted means." Ridge sniffed the air, then nudged Jonah forward, as if reminding him the group was waiting. They walked the short trail toward the clearing where the old Avery cabin once stood. Jonah had left a small wooden sign there. Not a memorial, just a marker of where the story began. The kids gathered around it. Some shivered, not from the cold, but from the idea of walking on the ashes of a mystery. Ms. Alden asked, "Can you tell them what happened here, Mr. Mercer? In a version that won't get me fired?" Jonah chuckled. "I'll keep it clean." He pointed toward the ground. 30 years ago, this land belonged to a miner named Elias Avery. Then one winter, he disappeared. No note, no footprints, nothing. The cabin froze in time. People stayed away. Stories grew. A girl raised her hand. "Like ghosts?" "More like the truth being buried," Jonah said. "And sometimes that's scarier." Ridge let out a low chuff, as if agreeing. They made their way back to the cabin, where Jonah opened the door and let the kids step inside. Their voices dropped instantly, replaced by the soft awe of seeing something crafted with care. Pine beams, stone hearth, wide windows showing the forest. A boy with freckles crouched beside Ridge, hand hanging in the air, waiting. Ridge leaned forward, sniffed, then pressed his forehead gently into the boy's palm. The boy lit up like someone had handed him fireflies. Ms. Alden asked, "Jonah, would you tell them how Ridge discovered everything under the old fireplace?" Jonah leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. "We showed up here during a storm. I barely knew what I'd bought. But Ridge, he walked straight to the hearth like he'd been here in another life. He wouldn't look away, wouldn't rest. Then he barked once." He paused. That bark was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't warning. It was direction. A girl in a red scarf asked, So he really knew something was down there? Ridge lifted his head at the question, as if recognizing the topic. Jonah nodded. Long before I did. He'd been in rescues with me. Avalanche zones, collapsed cabins, underground pockets. Dogs feel things we don't. They smell time. They hear what wood remembers. The girl's eyes widened. What did he find? Jonah motioned toward a shadow box display on the wall. Inside was a replica of the false stone, the hollowed chamber, and an old leather notebook sealed behind glass. The truth, Jonah said softly. Documents, journals, samples. Proof of what happened in this valley decades ago. Proof of what my father and Elias Avery tried to expose before they vanished. The room fell quiet. Even Ridge seemed stiller. One boy, smaller than the rest, stepped closer to Ridge. His voice cracked, high and sincere. Did Ridge know your dad wrote in those notebooks? Jonah inhaled slowly. The question landed deeper than the kid could ever understand. I don't think Ridge knew whose handwriting it was, he said. But he knew it mattered. He knew I needed to see it, and he wasn't going to let the world bury it again. The boy nodded as if he'd been handed something precious. Another student asked shyly, Could Ridge have saved your dad if he'd been here back then? Jonah's throat tightened. Ridge lifted his chin and pressed his shoulder into Jonah's leg, grounding him in a way only he could. Jonah answered carefully. Ridge saves who stands beside him. My father didn't have that, but his truth still found a way forward. Ridge just made sure I listened when it finally rose to the surface. A hush settled. It wasn't sadness. It was something quieter. Respect. Ms. Alden clapped lightly. All right, time to see the training field. The kids headed out, voices rising again. Jonah lingered inside, watching Ridge follow the group with that same steady gait. Half guardian, half teacher. On the porch, the smallest boy paused and looked back. Mr. Mercer? Yeah. The kid pointed at Ridge. So, that dog really barked because he knew the truth was under there? Jonah felt a warmth rise in his chest. He knelt, coming even with the boy. He never barked for fear, Jonah said. He barked to tell me what was real. Ridge turned, ears perked, as if claiming those words. Jonah stood, watching the boy run to catch up with his class, boots thumping softly on the gravel. Legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you protected while others learned to carry it. Ridge waited beside the path, tail lifting once in greeting, before guiding the children toward the open field where new rescue dogs practiced in the cold morning sun. The sun sat low behind the ridge, turning the frost on the porch rail into a sheet of quiet fire. Jonah stood beside the cabin's new stone steps while the camera crew unpacked their gear. Ridge lay at his feet, older now, muzzle brushed in silver, but his posture unchanged, alert, present, listening. A young reporter named Camilla Reyes adjusted her mic and stepped closer, boots crunching lightly across the gravel. Thank you for meeting us out here, Jonah. Folks have been wanting to hear from you since the Frost Canyon case closed for good. Jonah gave a small nod. Ridge lifted his head at the sound of a zipper and watched the cameraman with calm, assessing eyes. Camilla glanced toward Ridge. He's even more handsome in person. He knows that, Jonah replied. Ridge thumped his tail once, a dignified acknowledgement. They positioned themselves near the porch steps, letting the backdrop include both the forest and the cabin. It wasn't staged. It was just where the story belonged. Camilla consulted her notes. Last question of the day, and probably the one everyone wants to hear most. She paused, offering Jonah the chance to brace himself. What do you think Ridge knew that first night in the cabin? Before you knew anything? Before anyone knew anything? Jonah breathed in slow, cold air, pine, a faint scent of firewood still clinging to Ridge's fur. He looked down at the dog who had been beside him through storms, through danger, through loss, and through truth. Ridge met his eyes with the same steady intensity from the night the wind tried to tear the cabin apart. Jonah's voice was low, but steady. He didn't bark for danger. He let the words settle, the silence, bending around them like a held breath. He barked for the truth. The cameraman glanced up, caught off guard by the weight of it. Camilla swallowed, her expression shifting from professional interest to something quieter. Respect, maybe. Understanding. Ridge stood, shook out his coat and stepped forward until he stood squarely in frame. He lifted his head and let out a single, short bark. Sharp, clean, certain, as if punctuating Jonah's sentence. Camilla laughed softly. Perfect timing. That's him, Jonah said. Ridge always knows when the truth needs a voice. They wrapped the interview as the last of the light slipped behind the canyon. But Camilla lingered, hand hovering near her camera strap. Jonah, before we go, can I ask something off the record? Sure. She looked at Ridge again, softer this time. Do you think every dog has that in them? That instinct to protect? To reveal something we'd miss? Jonah considered the question. Ridge stood close enough that Jonah's fingers brushed the dog's back without thinking. Not every dog is Ridge, he said, but every loyal dog pays attention to the world in ways we forget to. And if we're smart, we listen. Camilla nodded like she'd been given advice she hadn't known she needed. When the news van finally pulled away, evening settled over the valley in long, slow strokes of blue. Jonah and Ridge stood together on the porch as headlights disappeared down the old access road. Jonah rubbed Ridge's shoulder. You ready? He asked. Ridge nudged his knee and sat beside him, the way he always did when a chapter closed, but the world kept turning. Jonah walked back toward the door, then paused and turned toward the small exterior camera mounted under the porch beam. It wasn't for security. It was for the channel. The red recording light blinked. Jonah looked straight into it. His voice carried the calm gravity of someone who had lived the story and survived it. If you've ever had a dog who stood between you and the dark, or nudged you toward something you didn't want to see, then you already know what this story is about. Ridge stepped into frame beside him, ears forward, eyes bright beneath their silver. Jonah rested a hand on Ridge's neck. What's your story with a loyal pet? Ridge let out one more quiet bark. Not loud, not warning, just truth. Jonah smiled, tired in the best way. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe in loyalty, instinct, and the kind of courage that walks on 4 legs, support the mission, share the truth, and subscribe to German Shepherd, where loyalty lives. Ridge pressed into Jonah's side, watching the camera with the calm authority of a dog who had once steered a man toward a buried secret. The screen faded on the two of them, silhouetted against the cabin lights. One man, one dog, and a truth that refused to stay buried.